This video is designed to help us understand both Kate Chopin, the writer, who's pictured here in the upper left, and the two short stories that we're reading of hers, The Story of an Hour and The Storm. They're different kinds of stories, but they have a very strong connection over the issue of what is a marriage all about. Chopin is a St. Louis native. She was born here in 1851. She left in 1870 to marry Oscar, her husband, who was a Louisiana cotton grower. And then she came back to St. Louis in the 1880s and then died here in 1904. The picture here is what's called the Kate Chopin house. This is a house on 4232 McPherson down in the Central West End, and it's the house that she lived in the last year of her life. It's the only house in St. Louis that's associated with her. It's in private hands. You can't visit it. It's not a museum. There's a plaque, and that's about it. But it shows you that Chopin, unlike a lot of the other authors that we're reading, has a strong local connection, and you can find sort of aspects of her life all over St. Louis if you look around. As I said, she got married in 1870. She was 19, and she moved to Louisiana. Oscar, her husband, and we'll see a picture of him on the next page, was a cotton factor. And this is somebody who contracted with cotton growers to buy their cotton, give them loans so they could grow their crop and then buy it when they were done with it, when it was ready to harvest. He wasn't very good at this. He also had a general store in a place called Cloutierville, Louisiana, which I've never been to. And this also was unsuccessful in many ways. He died very young and left her a widow with 6 children, and here are some of the children that she had. So she ended up running his business for a couple of years to try to pay back all of his debts. He owed, in contemporary dollars, about $400,000 when he died. And so unlike sort of the stereotype that we have about women in the 19th century, Chopin was able to operate a business successfully and pay back his debts. This is the house that they lived in. Was a plantation in Cloutierville, and this was a museum for a long time. Unfortunately, it burned down in 2008, and it was unrestorable, so it no longer exists. You can see a couple of pictures of Chopin here at different points in her life. This is when she graduated from a Catholic school in St. Louis as a teenager. This was after she was married. And this is the first book that she wrote. She wrote this in the 1890s. She wrote 2 books of short stories about the kinds of people who lived around her in Louisiana. And one of the example stories from that period, although it was not published in her lifetime, is The Storm. Okay. She moved to St. Louis in part because she still had family here. Her mother was here. They were middle class, affluent family. And she was able to live with her mother and then kind of make her own way with investments from Louisiana, plus eventually an inheritance from her mother. She never made much money from her writing, but she wrote a lot. We'll talk a little bit about that later. She also moved back to St. Louis because the schools were better. St. Louis schools at the end of the 19th century were some of the best in the country. This was the first school system in the United States to have kindergarten. And she had children. They could be educated for free here in the public school system. And she may be one of the few people that we know of who's ever moved to St. Louis for the public schools. But there you are. Here's a couple of more pictures of her. This is their wedding picture. This is, again, the 19-year-old Kate. This is her husband, Oscar. He was a few years older than she. And like a lot of other French Americans, he spent the Civil War in Paris to avoid being drafted into the Confederate Army. This was not uncommon. Not only did a lot of French men leave the United States, or men of French extraction, but also a lot of other Southern males, moved west. And if you know who Mark Twain is, which I assume everybody does, he's one of those guys. He spent 2 weeks in a Confederate militia unit and took off for the Nevada Territory with his brother, who was secretary to the governor. So some estimate that up to a third of males, white males in the Confederacy, left for the western part of the United States during the Civil War to avoid service. Um, Here are a couple of older pictures, or pictures of Chopin when she was older, when she was in her 50s. She was part of a literary salon here in St. Louis that had a number of different writers and critics in it. She was frequently published in the Post-Dispatch as well as in the Atlantic. The picture of the book plate here, this is the first edition of the book that she's most famous for, but it was also her least successful in her own time. It's a short novel called The Awakening, about a woman who's in a marriage that she's not happy with in Louisiana, and she leaves it and lives on her own, never divorces her husband, leaves her children, and sets herself up as an independent woman in New Orleans, and has affairs and relationships with all kinds of people. It's a fascinating book. But it was extremely unsuccessful in her lifetime because it was simply too daring. The idea of a woman leaving her children, leaving her husband, and setting up on her own was anathema. This photograph was taken pretty close to the last year of her life. I should mention that Chopin was about 5 feet tall. She wasn't very big. Um, and she gets stouter over time. She also smoked like a chimney. If you read her diaries, she talks about smoking all the time. She loved it. She loved to smoke. And I think one of the reasons that she died of a migraine after visiting the World's Fair in 1904 was that she was probably ill from the effects of tobacco. She is buried here in St. Louis. This is her gravestone. It's in Calvary Cemetery, the Catholic cemetery. And if you ever get a mind to, you're welcome to visit. You can see where she's laid to rest in a family plot. The two stories that we have are short, and most of her stories are short. Even The Awakening as a novel is fairly short, maybe 150 pages. I really like it, but uh, I'm not a rational person about Kate Chopin. Don't ask me why, as I couldn't tell you. The story of an hour can be read in about 10 minutes, but it literally is told almost in real time, in the sense that everything happens within an hour. And I think the compression of that adds a real sort of immediacy to it and some depth, because it replicates human consciousness in an interesting kind of way. But it's 2, 3 pages long. It's very short. Um, a woman thinks that her husband has been killed in a train wreck. And her initial response is not, oh, what am I going to do? But, oh, I'm free now. And so it's a meditation on freedom. And then she finds out that her husband is not dead. And the story ends the way that it does. Um, the It's interesting in here because women in this period of time, and we know this from reading Yellow Wallpaper, were regarded as somehow less than robust. But in this case, we have a woman who is, in fact, exactly that. We're told that she has a heart condition. And then the question is, does that heart condition kill her or does it not? And so one of the issues that you can think about in here is that, is this a story that in a subtle kind of way is playing against the kind of stereotypes and conventional wisdom that we had about women in the 19th century? It also looks at this issue of marriage and what exactly marriage is all about. From other stories that we've read, we know that marriages are complex places. But again, this is a story that plays with this stereotype that women want to be married, they want to stay home, they want to be, helpmeets to their husband, they want to establish a well-running household, and they're willing to suborn themselves for a marriage with a man. And of course, in our own time, we have different notions about marriage, but this stereotype is still a pretty profound one. Um, Not everybody signed up for, women working outside the home. Not everybody signed up for the idea that women can choose to have children or not. These are still issues that we're wrestling with in our own time. Um, and it gets complicated, uh, very complicated. But the story is one that focuses on a particular view of marriage by Mrs. Mallard, the main character. Um, and it does, again, kind of confront this stereotype about women. The Storm is a very different story. It is, in fact, about a marriage. And unlike the story of an hour, it's about real people. And I'll show you who they are later. And there's a whole bunch of issues that are crammed into this thing. But it's a story about a man and a woman who are married to other people who meet one day during a storm, and they have an affair. And it's, by sort of the standards of late 19th century writing, it's pretty graphic. It's not pornographic. There is, of course, massive amounts of British Victorian and Edwardian porn that was written in this time, mostly as novels, but this isn't in that category. This isn't a story written by men for other men, um, but this is a story by a very extraordinary woman writer. But it's a complicated story, and a lot of times when students read it, they go, "Oh my God, people wrote like this back then?" And the answer is yes, but this was a story that was not published in Chopin's lifetime. The date of the story, which I think is 1934, in our textbook, comes from the notebook. I'm sorry, the year this notebook was found. There's this particular story appears in a notebook that is dated 1897, and all the other pages in the notebook are ripped out. Chopin's papers are a mess, by the way. They're in a whole bunch of different places. They've been probably more mistreated than any other author's papers from the late 19th century in American literature. But anyway, this notebook was found, and there's only this one story in it. Other pages are missing. They've been torn out. And the question is, who tore them out? Did Chopin do that, or did somebody else do that? Was this a story that Chopin wrote for herself alone? Was this kind of a meditation of an older woman kind of thinking about sex with a man in an interesting kind of way? Or was it part of a series? Were there other stories that were like this in the notebook, and either she or someone else took them out? Maybe they were more graphic, maybe they were less graphic. I have no idea. Nobody knows. But it's a one-off, and it really is unique in the Chopin canon because there's no other story like it. There's also, it was never published in her lifetime. So did she decide not to have it published, or was it sent to a publisher and rejected? I can't imagine it being published in her lifetime by any of the publications that she wrote for. But that's another question. Nobody knows. I mean, it's this mysterious story, and we just have the one. The other thing that's interesting about this is that there are other issues besides man, woman, marriage to deal with, and that is issues of class. Calixta and Alcée are very different classes of people. Calixta is a country woman. Alcée is a rich landowner, a planter, and they would not have ever married each other, even though at one time they were fairly close. Another issue is this idea of duty. You know, do you have a duty to your class? Do you have a duty to your family? Do you have a duty to the sort of social norms of the period? You know, and where does duty lie? There's another more complex question, and that is, what is the duty of husbands and wives to each other? Because both of these are people who stray. Okay. This raises this third issue of family, and how important is family, and how important is maintaining a stable household, especially for women who by and large did not work outside the home in this period, unless they were poor, or unless they were farmers. And we got to remember, back in the time that this was written, even in the 1890s, that a majority of Americans were farmers. Now it's about 2% of Americans make a living from farming. In Chopin's time, it would have been between 50 and 60% of Americans were farmers. There were people like Bobineau, small landholders or tenant farmers who work land that belonged to other people. And then you have this third issue, this last issue here of culture. Alcée and Calixta are both Catholic, although that doesn't seem to enter the story at all. Chopin herself was Catholic. Her husband was Catholic. Her children were raised as Catholics, although none of her children, I should mention, ever married. And all of them had very odd lives after the stories, or after they grew to maturity. One of them, in fact, was the first editorial cartoonist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Fred. And that's, in fact, where Fredberg comes from, the little character in the Post-Dispatch. But these are all complex issues that the story raises. So not only do you have some fairly graphic sexual content in the story, you have these other issues that sort of raise up out of the text. And the ending is what tends to be where we focus a great deal of our time. And I won't spoil that for you by mentioning it here, but the ending is unexpected. Okay. Here are some slides that have to do with women's underwear. And you might wonder, why is this important? Does Mr. Burke have some kind of weird interest in women's underwear? Uh, no. Calixta is at home when this story takes place, and she's not dressed like she's going out. She's wearing a sack, is how she's described, and I'll describe what that is in a minute. But basically, what she's wearing is nothing except like a house coat. Okay, the kinds of things that Victorian women wore under their clothes were fairly extensive. They wore these drawers, or what were called these are I can't even pronounce it, pantanelles. They wore a camisole, which was a top over it. They had different kinds, and then they wore a corset. Um, and so you would have had, if you were a woman, several layers of clothing on when you went out of your house. I cannot imagine what a pain in the ass this must have been in Louisiana. Uh, every time we have a St. Louis summer, I always wonder how people made it here in the 18th and 19th centuries. You'll notice something odd that may strike you here, what these little dark spots are. Women's women underwear, in the sense that we women wear, underwear, it's very different because these are open. Okay, and this is to assist them with going to the bathroom. Okay, but anyway, Calixta is wearing none of this, and so it would have been unusual for a man like Alcée to have ever seen a woman without all of her clothes on, not only a dress, but all of this stuff underneath it. And so one of the reasons that Alcée gets excited uh, by Calixta is the fact that she is basically naked underneath this coat. That's a big deal in this story. This is a slide that I made of from a reproduction sewing website where you can buy clothes or you can buy patterns for 19th century clothing. And I'm not really sure. She's described as wearing a sack. A sack could come in a short form like this, and she might have had a petticoat on underneath it. Again, we're not told that, but we are told that there's nothing constraining her. She's not wearing a corset. She doesn't have these pantaloons on. She doesn't have a chemise. But she might have been wearing a petticoat. But again, she's not going outside the house. And this sack coat could have been made of fabric like this. This is another kind of sack. As you can see, it's a little longer. And then here's a third kind, which is kind of a house dress. This one's a little fancy, I think, for a farmer's wife. But these are the kind of the options here of what a sack from this period looks like. We don't have an equivalent piece of clothing, maybe a house dress that maybe your grandmother might wear or your great grandmother back in the days before women ever wore pants in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But at the time that this story is set, late 19th century, these would have been the kinds of things that women wore at home so that they didn't have to wear all that other stuff. But they would never wear this outside the house. They would never wear it if they thought they were going to see somebody. So again, this might have something to do with why Alcée and Calixta are able to have this affair so quickly, is that basically she's not wearing anything. Certainly nothing by the standards of the time. And that, I think, gets Alcée. This is the last slide. Uh, these are the real people. This is Calixta and this is Alcée. Albert Sampite, I think is how it's pronounced. Maybe it's Sampite. And Maria Norman Deluche. These are the Calixta and Alcée of the story. Calixta really was a lower born Creole Cajun woman. Albert was also of French background. The Cajuns and Creoles are kind of interesting. Creoles they're exactly the same, but Cajuns tend to be the working class end of the French Louisianans, and the upper end tend to call themselves Creoles. Don't ask me why they do that, but they do. And these are not very good likenesses, but these are the only ones that we have. But just to let you know, this is a story based on real people. And as the story tells us, these two had a relationship, but in all likelihood, from what we know of the period, not a sexual one, because of this gap in terms of their class. Um, and they met at one time, and we're told in the story. Do you remember Assumption? Well, that was where they met, Assumption Parish, and that's also where Cloutierville is. And so they knew each other. Um, we have no idea. They married other people. Calixta did marry somebody of her own class. Albert married somebody of his own class. And of course, people would do that because then you would combine family wealth uh, in ways that would be difficult for someone like Calixta, who didn't come from money. She doesn't have anything to offer a rich person in terms of financial support. So it's unlikely that they would have ever married, almost just for that reason. But there's also these other issues where they're just simply, in terms of social class, very far apart. But apparently they were in love with each other, but they knew that this was a love that would never go anywhere. Um, Neither of their families would have tolerated it. So the story that we have in The Storm is an imaginary one, so far as we know, but it's based on real people. And so that might be something that would interest you. And that's why I thought I'd spend some time on it. Well, I've talked more than I should. I hope you like the stories, and I hope you decide that you're going to like Chopin. She's one of my favorite writers because she challenges a lot of different assumptions about the way social structures are supposed to work. Um, I really like The Awakening, the story of Edna Pontellier, even though it ends in many ways badly for her. It's a story that I really can't ever get out of my head. And I've spent a lot of time reading it and studying Chopin uh, because she just fascinates me. Well, thank you for your attention. I'll be interested to see what you have to say.